So a couple years back, I was sitting at home bored, so I decided I would watch a film, but I didn't really know which one I wanted to start. I'd been going through Netflix, HBO, Hulu, basically all of them, so I decided it would probably be in my best interest to go with something that I knew, like a classic. I was thinking maybe Home Alone, Star Wars, The Dark Knight, literally all of these movies filtered through my head, but I decided to go with one that seemed to never fail me. There's literally nothing. I'm just gonna go with something that I know. Back to the Future. Now, as a relatively sane human being, Back to the Future means quite a lot to me, but as a guitar player, it means even more. I mean, there are so few moments in the history of cinema, especially in the modern day, that seem to do the electric guitar justice, but this one seems to be universally agreed upon as just like the chef's kiss of guitar playing in movies. I mean, from the 50s aesthetic to the climax of the plot to the fact that he was playing one of the most famed six strings in the history of the electric guitar, the Gibson 335. But wait, one Leah Thompson loving second. I'm noticing something for the first time. You see it? How in the world did I not notice it until now? That guitar that he's about to play? This thing has 5 switches, not 4 switches, which makes one of them a baritone knob, which means that it's a 345, not a 335. And trust me, I'll explain the baritone in a second. Now, that might not necessarily be the grandest revelation in the world until I started doing my research and I found out that the 345 wasn't invented until 1958, and the Under the Sea Dance takes place on November 12th, 1955, which means that my entire life, I had been lied to. Now, in my distress, I knew that it would be my absolute responsibility to share this information with the general public. I mean, this was groundbreaking news that was going to, break the internet, as the kids say. But the more I actually started to dig through the ever-expanding landscape that we come to call the guitar forum world, I began to realize pretty quickly that I wasn't the first ever person to make this great discovery. I mean, there were entire articles written on the nuances of trying to fit a 345 in 1955 in what was realistically an insignificantly small plot hole in what was otherwise a near perfect film. But the more I continued to think about it, there was just one thing that still stumped me about the whole situation. Our good friend Marty was playing a 345, which I had originally thought was a 335, both of which had yet to be invented yet, but even more importantly, what is even the difference? And what I found was that the 345 was released to be a more premium or high-end version of that original 335 model. And not only that, but they actually had a third brother in the lineup that was supposed to be the most prestigious of all three at one point, called the 355. Now, getting your hands on an actual 355 in today's economy, you're probably looking at about $7,000 new for a reissue. And if you're trying to get an actual vintage one, we're talking 5 figures easy. So I decided on what seemed to be the next best thing. So let me actually show you what I'm talking about. So this, friends, is the 59 Epiphone ES355, and for all intents and purposes, the only difference between this and the $7,000 model is where it's made and the poly finish versus the nitro finish. Well, Mike, with all that being said, you still haven't told me what are the actual differences between the 355 and both of those sister models. Well, I'll tell you this, a lot of the bigger differences actually have to do with the aesthetics of the instrument. With the 355 having an ebony fretboard, which some players say produces a slightly brighter tone. I mean, at one point, the absolute legend that is Robin Ford even said that he prefers his 355 to his 335 because to his ear, it had a much bigger sound. Now, Ford wasn't the only player rocking a 355 back in the day. The absolute legend that is Noel Gallagher has talked about his love for the instrument time and time again, calling it his favorite guitar that he actually purchased throughout all the 90s. Specific 355 is actually a 1960 model, and it had this thing called a baritone switch. I don't know if you remember, but we briefly mentioned it earlier. Now, the baritone switch would usually be right here next to some of your knobs, and what you would do is you would turn it, and with each position, it would filter out more and more of your low end. But that's not even like the craziest difference between something like this and a lot of the early original models. Because in 1959, Gibson actually started manufacturing and wiring stereo stereo version. And what that means is that you could send the signal from each individual pickup to different amps. Now, looking back, we can pretty clearly see that those weren't the most popular ideas that Gibson's ever had. I mean, outside of like the BB King guitars, the Veritone. So eventually it was discontinued along with the Veritone switch on most non-BB King related 355 guitars. And modern day 355s began to look and sound more and more like this guy right here. Now, for me specifically, that's a really cool thing because I'm not necessarily used to this specific sound. I don't spend a lot of my time playing semi-hollow guitars, and specifically when it comes to Gibsons, a lot of the humbucker tone that my mind tends to immediately go to is that of a Les Paul, but this is a completely different humbucker sound. I think that same thing applies to all the pickup positions, like even when I go to the middle. And I think the same exact thing goes for the treble pickup. Now, I feel like one of the most interesting conversations in all of this isn't even necessarily about the tone, but about getting used to the semi-hollow body shape as a whole. This isn't a completely new concept to me in totality, just because the Epiphone Dot was actually the first electric guitar that I ever bought with my own money. But when you spend a number of years playing Strat, Strat, Tele, Strat, Strat, Tele, PRS, Strat, Strat, Tele, you get away from those larger body shapes no matter what guitar you're playing. So getting used to something like this was always going to be a completely different ballgame. I think it's just the way it rests against your body. Not that it's bad, but it's just new. So outside of the general tone and just getting used to this body shape, there really is just one more question that needs to be asked about these guitars in particular. And you probably could have guessed it going in because it has a lot to do with, well, the name on the headstock. You see, I think this right here matters a lot more than just having another cost-effective alternative to the Gibson brands. And I think a lot of that is because in my mind, I used to put Epiphones in two specific categories. You had your cost-effective Gibson alternatives, and then you had your high ends like the Epiphone Casinos that were like in that $3,000-$4,000 price range. But with something like this, or just the inspired by Gibson Custom Shop line as a whole, once you start putting Gibson Custom Shop humbuckers in your Epiphones, there really is no going back. Because if we zoom into the 355 in particular, when someone's picking between this or an actual Gibson 335, outside of guys like Joe Bonamassa himself, like 99.99% of the guitar world are not going to be like, I need that $7,000 version. They're probably going to go for something like this, which I think makes this more of a competitor to something like a regular Gibson ES 335 rather than a Gibson 355. So people are going to have to start making those decisions with the more inspired by custom shop lines versus the regular 335s and 345s. And it's going to be interesting to see how that actually goes down. Because at $1,299, realistically, this is still in the high end of Epiphone guitars price-wise. But I do think there will be a lot of people who, much like with the higher end casinos, are going to think of something like this. And they're going to be like, I actually really like the fact that this headstock right here says Epiphone. And at the end of the day, a lot of that I think is really going to come down to personal preferences. And I have mine, but I don't think it matters what I think. What matters is what you think. So please let me know. What's your favorite Epiphone guitar? What do you think of the Epiphone inspired by Gibson Custom Shop line and what they've been doing more recently as a whole? What do you think of the 355s versus the 335s? Please let me know in the comments. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this video. I've been wondering when the next Epiphone video is actually going to come, especially with the fact that my Casino has been broken for a while. I've had it for like 10 months, but something happened to it and I haven't had the time to get it fixed yet. So it's cool to be able to take a look at the other end of the Epiphone spectrum, from like the Casinos that are going for like $400 to this right here. But if you do want to know anything more about this bad boy right here, the 355 Casino, I got it from the homies at Sweetwater. The links are in the description. Make sure to check it out. It's one of the best ways to support the channel if that's something you want to do, or if you're just curious about any of the other gear that I used in this video, from the Tone King or the mics, anything like that. Make sure to check out those links. Also, thank you so much to all of my patrons. There's some exclusive bonus content on there, not found on this page. If you want to check it out and join the community, like and subscribe if you had a good time, and most importantly, like most important of all, have a fantastic night.